which I recommend you take in small portions because it's I'm buzzing now. I've been having a good morning. I hope you are too. Reminder for people online, if you have questions, please email them to holymoot@gmail.com. And we will waste no time, but we will dive into our next speaker. Let me introduce to you Dr. Lisa Coutras is a theologian and scholar specializing in the intersection of theology, philosophy, and literature. She holds a PhD in theology and religious studies from King's College London, where she conducted groundbreaking research on the theological aesthetics of J.R.R. Tolkien, published as Tolkien's Theology of Beauty, Majesty, Splendor, and Transcendence in Middle-earth. She currently serves as adjunct faculty at West Virginia University in the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry, contributing to interdisciplinary research on the intersection of addiction, psychiatry, and literature. She also teaches part-time for Houston Christian University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lisa Coutras.
Good morning. So excited to be here. I must apologize. I have had a terrible cold for about 2 weeks, and so if I start gagging at any point, that is why. I have tea, and you may see me stop and drink it. So I appreciate your patience with that. I am really excited to bring this particular talk to you because I've never gotten to give it for my people, the Tolkien people. So far, we've only given it for healthcare professionals. And usually I co-present with my colleague and boss, Dr. Jim Barry, who is an addiction psychiatrist. So I actually work in a psychiatry department in administration. So I'm not actually a psychiatrist, but I have a background in theology, and I work at a desk in psychiatry. So we put our heads together, and I said to him one day, why don't we do a talk on addiction and Tolkien? Because actually we were planning an addiction conference, and then a speaker dropped out, so I just proposed it, and he said, let's do it. And here we are, 3 years later. So we've actually given it in Germany, we've given it at some national conferences, and it's interesting how receptive the healthcare community has been, even though this is very Tolkien, very literature-based, but Tolkien really resonates with these themes. And so I think that we as human beings can draw so much from his stories. So the plan for this journey is that I'll be looking at the context of Tolkien as a trench writer and how that influenced his understanding of human nature and addiction, and also what does he show us about addiction in his stories. And with that context, he gives us hope and purpose, but what does that look like? It's not just what we might think of as simple hope or simple purpose, but it's a lot deeper than that. And finally, the power of community in recovery from addiction. So looking at Tolkien as a trench writer, why are we looking at Tolkien, first of all, when it comes to something like addiction? Because addiction, it has so much stigma, it affects so many people. And in fact, these days, a lot of people have either experienced it themselves or someone they love, whether it's a close relative or a friend. And so the reason that I chose Tolkien, other than the fact that my study is Tolkien, is that you see this theme of addiction all throughout, but also Tolkien's stories have endured through the generations. And something that witnessed to people or affected people back in the 50s or 60s also affects people today. And actually it is so culturally ingrained at this point that it makes sense to look at Tolkien for this theme. And he had such a keen insight into what it means to be human. And it covers all these different aspects, whether it's despair or grief or darkness. he really dug into these themes. And so addiction is actually a running theme. And it's funny because when I talk to healthcare professionals, they think, oh, is it like the pipe weed? They're having an addiction to the pipe weed. But then you talk to a Tolkien person, and they know exactly it's the addiction to the ring, obviously. So I appreciate you all, because I'm sure that's what you all thought. But interestingly, even though addiction is so central to his stories, it is not really addressed, to my knowledge, in Tolkien studies. Or if it is, it must be very recent. But when it is talked about, it's very much in passing. It's mentioned, or they talk about the will to power or something like that. But they don't really talk about addictive tendencies or addiction as a subject. Now, we know how Tolkien felt about allegory, and we know that his story is not an allegory of addiction. It's not an allegory of anything. However, he did acknowledge that you can apply things to yourself individually, that these stories can be applicable to you, and it might be applicable to someone else in a different way. So that is the approach that I'm taking, is that these themes of addiction can be very applicable to us today. Now, Tolkien is what's known as a trench writer, or someone who survived the First World War, who wrote, whether it was poetry or novels or another work of literature. And these trench writers, their writings are often characterized by despair and meaninglessness. They're basically trying to expunge the nightmare. They're trying to exorcise the nightmare. And as a result, these stories are very dark and very hopeless. Now, Tolkien knew despair, he knew trauma, he survived the Battle of the Somme. And so you see that a lot of his stories contain darkness, it contains defeat, evil will sometimes triumph. He calls this the long defeat. And you see this in the words of Galadriel when she says that through the ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. But even with this approach, there's no hint of defeatism. He does not give up. It's simply, we're going to keep fighting, even though we know that this defeat is ongoing. So it's this stubborn inclusion of hope and purpose. He doesn't give up, and he puts hope and purpose in the center. John Garth writes that Tolkien's stories frequently involve the ironic downturn characteristic of classic trench writing, the disaster or discovery that undermines all achievements and threatens to snuff out hope. That downturn, however, is not the pivotal moment that matters most in Middle-earth. He makes despair or disenchantment the prelude to a redemptive restoration of meaning. So Tolkien, having experienced the Great War, gave a lot of thought to darkness and the dark themes of the human condition. So he doesn't shy away from themes like despair and suicide or violence, and especially addiction. Now, he acknowledged that war was traumatic and horrific, and he also acknowledged that addiction is complicated. Now, we know from scientific research and studies that addiction is closely related to trauma, that there's oftentimes a relationship. So a lot of times it's a childhood trauma, but it doesn't have to be. It can be any kind of deep emotional wounding that causes someone to want to cope or self-medicate. And this leads to what we call the diseases of despair, the suicidality, overdose, alcoholism, these things that are driven by despair. Now, Frodo's experience is very comparable to war trauma. He goes through the War of the Ring. He is traumatized by the ring. Now, his experience with addiction can be viewed through this lens of war trauma. But to be clear, this is not a lecture about veterans. It is not a lecture about war trauma in particular, but it's the context for Frodo's addiction. It is the context for disenchantment and despair. But this is also where Tolkien gives us hope and shows us resilience. Now, Tolkien said that a major theme, if not the central theme, is death and immortality, that he constantly goes back to these ideas. And when he says that, what he's talking about is, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human in terms of our immortal lives? What does it mean in terms of our death, eternity? What does it mean to be fully human? What does it mean to lose our humanity? Now, for Tolkien, he believed that human beings are both natural and spiritual. They have a physical body, they have a soul, and that there's more to us than nature. In fact, Tolkien loved nature, he loved science, but as he put it, he did not want to be quibbled into science and cheated out of fairy. Nature is no doubt a life study, but there is a part of man which is not nature, and is in fact wholly unsatisfied by it. So he was fully willing to admit that nature was worth studying, but there's more to it than that. Now, for Tolkien, humans were created in the image of God. This is what gave them their value. And something like addiction and trauma dehumanizes us. But even in that dehumanization, we still have the value of God's image. He writes in Mythopoeia, "Man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned." So he's saying that even though we have fallen, even though we have experienced something dark and traumatic, even though maybe we have become addicted and have lost a lot of our humanity, our value has not changed. We are still made in the image of God. So for Tolkien, human beings are both nature and spirit, and our value comes from God's image. But we're also narrative beings, that we live our lives as story. We live our lives as a succession of events over a trajectory of time. So we are story, and therefore resonate with story. And this is why story can speak into the deep things of the human condition. That's why it can wrestle with things like despair and loss. And so the same story, because we are story, can be effective over generations, throughout history. It can affect different people in different ways. But story can definitely be universal. And this is because stories, the good stories, have this inner consistency of reality. And when it contains hope and purpose that has wrestled with the darkness, it gives us a roadmap. In his essay on fairy stories, he talks about three elements that give fairy stories their value. He says that fairy stories give us an escape. And it's not escapism. It's not the flight of the deserter from reality. Rather, he calls it's the escape of the prisoner. Why wouldn't we want to leave a place that's dark and find a place that is light? So these stories give us that escape to something that is light. They give us consolation. And this ties into his concept of the eucatastrophe, the joy of the deliverance when the unexpected rescue comes. And this unexpected rescue, it's not simply the happy ending. It's the unexpected, rare rescue. It does not deny sorrow and failure. In fact, sorrow and failure must exist in order for the eucatastrophe to exist. In order to be rescued, one must be lost. And lastly, recovery. These stories allow us to see things as we were meant to see them. It gives us reality anew. It allows us to see true reality. So story has the power to heal, has the power to heal the soul. And this is because it uses beauty to speak to the imagination. And through beauty, these stories can convey goodness and truth. Now, there's a clinical psychiatrist named Jonathan Shea that actually posited that Homer's Iliad, this beautiful poem, was originally written and created precisely for combat trauma. It was written and recited as therapy for these warriors that would come back from battle and be traumatized by the loss of their friends, by the horrors that they had seen, and they couldn't talk about it. Of course, when it's traumatic, you can't talk about it. It's more than what words can express. And so this poem was written as therapy for these warriors. And this is because this poem taught them to love beauty again. They didn't have to talk about their trauma, but they were given beauty. And so it uses beauty as the gateway to healing. Now, Timothy Batista says that this beautiful story, the Iliad, arouses our empathy for its warriors, for all warriors, and for ourselves if we are warriors. And thus we become true. We return to sanity. This then is our program: beauty first, goodness, and finally, truth. So next, what does Tolkien actually think about addiction? How does he portray it in his narratives? So of course we know that there's the One Ring, there are the Silmarils, the Arkenstone. I mean, these jewels of value that elicit greed. And these things are objects of power. They use addiction as a driving force. They drive people to certain actions. But we see the same kinds of immediate effects. We see isolation, people withdrawing from their communities, from their friendships, from their relationships. And there are far-reaching effects. You see whole kingdoms annihilated. You see beauty ravished. Now, the primary victims of addiction are those who have experienced addiction in Lord of the Rings. The most obvious would be Frodo and Gollum. And they're actually a very interesting pair because they have a lot of similarities, and so you can use this comparison. And in their stories, you can see these common themes of this interplay between body and spirit. You can see this interplay between choice and impairment, and also the erosion of being as a result of addiction. And lastly, it is anti-community. Addiction isolates the self, and you impose upon yourself an excommunication. So first, Tolkien highlights this interdependence of body and spirit, because we are both physical and spiritual beings. Now, addiction is both a spiritual temptation as well as a physiological or psychological disorder. You'll often hear addiction referred to as a disease, and you'll find that that's one view of addiction, but actually it's very nuanced. It's a disorder, but there's also something spiritual about it. And the spiritual part is when you have the willpower, when you have the ability to choose, you make the choice and you resist. You find that support, you find those people to help you. But there are limitations to the soul-body structure. Tolkien writes that we are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the powers of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. We can't always just say no. We are broken. We can't always make that choice. And we find that Frodo had greater ability to resist early on in the story. He could say no to the ring, but as his trauma increased, as the weight of the ring increased, and as time went on, his physical strength and his spiritual strength decreased. He was less able to resist. So personal choice does play a role, but we find that as one becomes addicted to something, addiction rewires the brain. And over time, this ability to choose diminishes. And even though that choice diminishes more and more and more, there's still some element of choice remaining. When Gandalf is describing Gollum, he says that Gollum was not wholly ruined. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own. But almost in the same breath, Gandalf says he hated everything, and the ring most of all. He hated it and loved it, as he hated and loved himself. But he could not get rid of it. He had no will left in the matter. So on the one hand, there was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, but on the other, he had no will left. So there's both. He retained an element of himself that can make choices, but his brain was rewired. He couldn't resist the ring. So also with Frodo, personal choice early on, and later on, he couldn't resist. Early in the fellowship, we read that the two powers strove in him. For a moment, perfectly balanced between their piercing points, he writhed, tormented. Suddenly, he was aware of himself again, Frodo, neither the voice nor the eye, free to choose, and with one remaining instant in which to do so, he took the ring off his finger. He could say no at that point. He had the will. But then you know that he failed. He claimed the ring as his own in the end. And Tolkien writes that at the last moment, the pressure of the ring would have reached its maximum. impossible for anyone to resist, certainly after long possession, months of increasing torment, and when starved and exhausted. Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely. So Tolkien is actually saying Frodo couldn't resist. He had no choice left. There was no will remaining. However, he still puts a great value on choice. There is a choice that can be made, even if it's a little choice. He chose to continue the quest. Even though he couldn't give up the ring at that point, he continued the quest. He chose to allow Sam to help him. He didn't just resist help. And he chose mercy to Gollum. And it's those little choices over a trajectory of time that created the context for his deliverance, that ended up saving his life. Gollum as well has the ability to choose. He can't resist the ring, but he chose to help Frodo. He loved Frodo and entered into community with him. He chose to have that connection. So for Gollum, you have love as a choice, but you also have the impairment from the addiction. So what would have happened if Gollum had continued his path to recovery, if he had continued to be trying to be good? Tolkien writes that though the love for Frodo would have been strengthened daily, it could not have wrested the mastery from the ring. But I think he would then have sacrificed himself for Frodo's sake and have voluntarily cast himself into the fiery abyss. So he's saying that even if at that point he couldn't resist the ring, if Gollum still needed the ring, he would have given himself for Frodo because he loved Frodo. He would have made that choice. So for Tolkien, choice is crucial even if it's small. But at the same time, we have to understand that impairment is real. The brain has been rewired. And so choice can diminish over time, but a choice can still be made. And one is only held accountable for what one is actually able to do. So Tolkien says that Frodo's real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. And he did that. I do not myself see that the breaking of his mind and will under demonic pressure after torment was any more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been. So for him, Frodo had made all the right choices. He did what he could. He went as far as he could. So when his mind and will broke, it was not a moral failure. So a moral failure, he says, can only be asserted when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. So the next point is that trauma and addiction cause a fragmentation. It dehumanizes us. It unravels our character. And Timothy Batista says that these are those who have encountered the very antithesis of beauty, who have endured the type of shocking and horrible experience that threaten to degrade and disintegrate our human identity. So this unravels us. It takes over who we are. Now, Tolkien portrays this in many of his characters. You see this in the Nazgul, whose being has wraithed, that they have diminished in themselves. They no longer even have a physical form. Gollum has so withered that he is no longer a hobbit like he used to be. Sauron is no longer embodied. So you see this juxtaposition between being and unbeing, that there's the loss of character, the loss of humanity, but then there's also this fullness of character, this fullness of humanity. And so actually it's interesting, and I don't talk about this here, but Frodo by the end was like a clear glass filled with light. So his being had wraithed, he had lost much of himself, but there was still light and beauty shining forth from him. So there's this paradox of both splendor and the diminishing of self. So he has fully lost his will to the ring, but he has continued on his path of light. And lastly, addiction is anti-community. It pulls us away from relationships and connection. It is a self-imposed excommunication. With Gollum, you see this early on when he kills his friend and withdraws from his community. He goes into isolation for hundreds of years and loathes himself, hates himself. Frodo also develops paranoia and irritability, withdraws from his friends, withdraws into isolation, and also hates himself. So as in any all-engulfing experience, you obtain a knowledge that totally overtakes you. But when such an experience includes trauma, other effects are added, including the cutting of communion, the unraveling of character, which is exactly what happens to Frodo. Which brings us to Tolkien's portrayal of hope in this context. Now, for Tolkien, hope isn't just about thinking positive. It's not about wishful thinking or looking up. It's not simple. For him, it's deep. It's about trust. In fact, it meant so much to him that he created his own word in Elvish, and the elves had a different understanding of hope than humans did. For them, it meant to trust, to live in trust, whereas for men, it meant to make a wish, to just think positive, to be optimistic. It's not about optimism. You can face reality, but act in trust. In fact, Aragorn's Elvish name was Estel because he was the hope of Middle-earth. So hope is not based on optimism, it's based on trust. So to hope in Middle-earth, or at least from the perspective of the elves, to hope is to act in trust. It's a way of living. Compare this to the Alcoholics Anonymous' 12 steps. First step is to admit you're powerless. Second step is to believe in a power greater than yourself. And a third step is to turn your will and your life over to God. Compare this to Aragorn's march against the Black Gate. We see that Denethor, the steward of Gondor, has just fallen into madness and has thrown himself over the edge into suicide. And this is because he saw that there was no hope left for Middle-earth. And so Gandalf, he gives counsel to Aragorn. He tells him to recognize his powerlessness, to believe in a higher power, and to trust in that higher power. "My lord," said Gandalf, "listen to the words of the steward of Gondor before he died. You may triumph on the fields of Pelennor for a day, but against the power that has now arisen, there is no victory. I do not bid you despair as he did, but to ponder the truth in these words. Hardly has our strength sufficed to beat off the first great assault. The next will be greater. This war, then, is without final hope, as Denethor perceived. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be." So first he tells him to recognize his powerlessness. He says, "I do not bid you to despair, but to ponder the truth." Recognize reality. There is no hope. The power is too great. Do not shy from the truth. But then he tells him to believe in a power greater than himself, to give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it may be. Now, it's implied because it suggests a belief in providence, because there's a higher power at work. Because the success of Frodo's quest is a mere chance, and they acknowledge it's a mere chance, but they send him out anyway, in trust, in hope. "In wisdom or great folly," he says, "the ring has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us." Elsewhere, he says, "There never was much hope, just a fool's hope." So there is hope, just not in the way you think. Elsewhere, he says to Frodo, when Bilbo found the ring, there was more than one power at work. He says that behind there was something else at work, not just Sauron, beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker, in which case you were meant to find it. So there's a higher power at work. There's something other than the power of Sauron at work. So he's telling him that there is a greater power, to believe in that greater power, and now he must trust in that greater power. He tells Aragorn, we must walk open-eyed into the trap with courage. He doesn't shy from reality. There is no hope. Walk into the trap, because our hope is different. We have a higher power. So Aragorn ponders these words, and he says, "As I have begun, so I will go on." We come now to the very brink where hope and despair are akin. So he's not saying that there is no despair, but he's still going to act in trust. So Frodo's task is just a fool's hope, according to Gandalf. There is nothing in this world or this reality that tells us he's going to succeed. But Aragorn acted in trust on this small hope, this fool's hope. Hope and despair can exist at the same time. Now, hope as trust, acting in trust, requires courage. And courage requires fuel. How do you fuel courage? Well, you need purpose. It's your why for living. It's your why for what you do. As Simon Sinek says, it is a compelling higher purpose that inspires us and acts as the source of all we do. We see this in the tragic heroes of ancient myth, that these were the heroes who had something to live for, who could make that last stand, who were willing to die for it. Stanley Cavell says that what founds these lives is clear enough. It's the capacity to love, the strength to found a life upon a love. So their founding purpose was love, but it was also the hope that there was someone or something that was worth fighting for. So purpose is that fuel that provides courage in the face of despair. So when you feel despair, that courage sustains you. It is the strength that allows you to act in trust. So there's this interconnectedness of hope and purpose. But even when hope diminishes, purpose continues to give you strength. And you see that in Tolkien, love and beauty are often those things that give his characters purpose. Catherine Matson writes about exactly this. She says that there is another kind of hope in the book, one that has nothing to do with overcoming death. It has little even to do with the future. It is attached to the present, sometimes to the past, and its effect is not to override despair, but to give people small measures of strength to keep acting in spite of it. It's what the hobbits feel when they see the elves or the stars. It is what the reader feels about the languages and half-told histories and the sense of beholding a separate world. She doesn't name it, but she's talking about beauty. We see this enacted in Tolkien's theory of courage. It's the final stand of the doomed hero. It's the tragic hero that is willing to make that stand even though he knows he will not win. In the Battle of Malden, which Tolkien translated, we read the hero saying, "Will shall be sterner, heart the bolder, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens." We see the same sentiment echoed in Sam when he's in Mordor. Tolkien writes, "Even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair, nor weariness, nor endless barren miles could subdue." So in Mordor, Sam is exhausted, he's starved, the power of Sauron is at its greatest, all other powers are subdued, but he is driven with purpose. He loves Frodo, loves the Shire. And this high beauty peeks through the clouds and pierces his heart with hope. His driving purpose is love and beauty. So also with Frodo. His whole purpose was to save the Shire. He loved the Shire. But in his despair, he loses sight of that. He can't see the beauty of the Shire anymore. But it's Sam that sustained him. So when he lost his hope, and when he lost his purpose, he still had something to sustain him, which was Sam, that relationship, that connection. And he was also sustained by trust in a higher power, which in this context was Galadriel and her star glass, which brings us to the power of community and recovery. So we know that in the 12 steps that it's important to acknowledge your powerlessness. Now, this is because they know that we cannot save ourselves, that we cannot be isolationists. We need other people. We need community to heal. And also, we must rely on a higher power because hope requires trust, and you need a higher power to trust in and to act for. And purpose is the driving strength of that hope and that trust. And now we know that addiction is self-focused, It is anti-community. It pulls you away from people. It isolates you. But healing and recovery can only be found in other people. It can only be found in that connection. Now, we know that Tolkien really prized community and friendship. We see this in his relationship with Edith early on. We see this with his closest friends during the war, and later on with C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. Friendship was very central to what he lived and what he believed. And we see that in Lord of the Rings, it's the fellowship that is needed in order to enact the quest. It's not just one person, it's all the characters. They're all needed. They all play a huge role in the story. Now, Sam and Frodo have a community together as well. That Frodo is completely reliant on Sam. He cannot carry out the quest by himself, even though he tried initially. So even though he tries to isolate himself as the story goes on, Sam is absolutely loyal. He never leaves his side. But then there's also this community or this connection between Frodo and Gollum. He shows him mercy. And in return, Gollum gives Frodo love, that he actually starts to change and wants to change. So in this community that can bring healing in this type of situation where addiction or trauma is involved, mercy is an absolute requirement. And Tolkien also calls it pity. It's like this compassionate empathy that to show mercy to someone. Frodo initially condemned Gollum to death, but later pitied him after he also experienced the ring. So the pity of Bilbo, whereas Bilbo showed pity to Gollum and spared his life, that is what ends up saving Middle-earth ultimately, because he spared his life, Frodo spared his life, and because they both spared his life, Middle-earth was ultimately saved, as was Frodo. Now, one view of Frodo's failure to destroy the ring is that he was a traitor, that he should be hung for treason, that there were actually people that wrote to Tolkien and said that he should be tried for treason. But Tolkien's response was Frodo couldn't actually destroy the ring. He had no ability at that point. That his mind, the breaking of his mind was no different than the breaking of his body. But his past choices created the context for the mercy that was shown to him. Since he showed mercy to Gollum, he himself was shown mercy. Tolkien writes in his letters that the catastrophe of Frodo at Mount Doom exemplifies the familiar words, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." This is the harder and less often considered petition. There are abnormal situations in which one may be placed, which demand a strength of body and mind which he does not possess. He is, in a sense, doomed to failure, doomed to fall to temptation or be broken by pressure against his will, that is, against any choice he could make or would make unfettered, not under duress. So there are situations, he says, that we must be delivered from. We can't actually win that situation. We can't make the choice to get out of it. We must be delivered. So for Tolkien, there are these far-reaching effects of mercy that it is an absolute requirement in community in order to heal, that we must forgive. And so for Tolkien, there was hope for Gollum, that he wasn't just this bad character. He actually wanted him to be redeemed. As an author, he didn't know if Gollum would be redeemed. But we see that Frodo hoped for Gollum's cure. You hear that Gandalf and Aragorn, they make comments that they want him to be cured. And even this comment is a hope that is trusting. So mercy is foundational to any kind of recovery, and it's relational. So for Gollum, he had a choice, as we know, even in his impairment. He had love for Frodo, which was his choice, and was actually, realistically, in the process of changing, and was offered mercy. He was offered connection. So Tolkien, not knowing the outcome of Gollum, was actually grieved when Gollum made his choice. He let his characters play out as they would, that they would make their own choices. So when Gollum made the choice for hatred for Sam over love for Frodo, Tolkien actually wept. He said that he came across the old manuscripts and they were tear-stained at Gollum's fall. He says that Gollum had his chance of repentance and of returning generosity with love and had fallen off the knife edge. It was more important to him to hate Sam than it was to love Frodo. Tolkien writes that we have to face the fact that there are persons who yield to temptation, reject the chances of nobility or salvation. Gollum weakened himself for the final chance when dawning love of Frodo was too easily withered by the jealousy of Sam. So in the end, Gollum had to make a choice. He rejects love. He rejects community. He chooses himself. He isolates. But healing and recovery can only be found through community and connection. And community, just like story, starts with beauty. It starts with the imagination. It is the psychological bridge to healing beauty. But when trauma, when addiction is so great that you have been excommunicated, even if it is self-imposed, the forces that recommunicate you or bring you back into the community, these forces have to be greater than the trauma. They have to be greater than the addiction. That love has to be so great and so merciful in order to bring recovery. And that this unraveling of being can only be reconstituted through interpersonal communion. Timothy Petitsa says that beauty unfolds into the goodness of purified self-offering for others. We give of ourselves wholly and completely to heal others. Now, Frodo's recovery is precisely through community. Yes, it's Sam's steadfast loyalty through horror and trauma, but there are others who helped him on his journey. We see Galadriel gave him the star glass, the phial. And now it's a vessel that captures the light of the stars, the light of a special star, and it becomes a light in dark places. It gives him strength, gives him protection, gives him guidance. And this is the intervention of a higher beauty and a higher power. We see also that Arwen helped him. In the films, you know that she gives her jewel to Aragorn, but in the book, she gives it to Frodo. And it's when she sees that Frodo is suffering. He's come back from Mordor, he's survived, but he has traumatic memories, he has PTSD, he hates himself, he longs for the ring, he still misses the ring, and because he misses the ring, he hates himself more, he has nightmares, and so she tries to think of a way to heal him. She gives him her jewel as a way to cope. And in the end, she offers him her place in Valinor. Now, as we know, Valinor is not death. It is a real place in Middle-earth, not real in our reality, maybe, we think. Could be real. And it's a place of everlasting beauty. And it's beauty that heals the soul. And Tolkien writes that for Frodo, this would be a period of reflection and peace, spent still in time, amid the natural beauty of Arda unmarred, the earth unspoiled by evil. But it's not just beauty, not just high beauty and everlasting beauty. It's community, relationship. He goes with Bilbo, the person that he most loved. And also later, Sam comes as well. So Frodo's recovery is directly tied to other people. It's tied to beauty, and it's tied to love. Now, Tolkien recognizes that addiction is dark, that it's a struggle and it's traumatic, and recovery can be a very long road. But he offered a solution through hope that is trust, through purpose that is fueled by love and beauty, and through community that offers mercy and pity, that is an empathy, a compassion. And this community begins with beauty, because beauty heals the soul. Now, in summary, Tolkien's experience of the war gave him profound insights into human nature. He saw that there were profound instances of darkness and trauma and despair of the human condition. But he wrestled with this in order to find hope and purpose in all contexts, especially in this context of Frodo's struggle with the ring. He provides hope and purpose as antidotes to despair and the diseases of despair. And he posits that recovery and healing comes through human connection. But in that human connection, mercy is an absolute requirement. And choice matters even if it's a small choice, even if it's just love, to act in love or to act in mercy. So we find that love and human connection is the beauty that brings soul healing and recovery. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So, who would like to delve deeper with a question? Has anyone got a hand? Because I don't want to. Yeah, we'll go straight to. I'll put these down so I don't drop anything. We'll come to Benjamin first. Okay. And go.
Thank you. That was wonderful. The section where you were talking about people writing to Tolkien and saying that Frodo should be hung as a traitor, I'd never heard that before, but it made me think of a similar reaction I saw in some reviews to Martin Scorsese's movie Silence, which is about 17th century Jesuit missionaries going to Japan, and most of them are tortured into apostasy. And a lot of people had very sympathetic reactions to that, but I saw a prominent Catholic bishop, among others, talking about that as, you know, special forces troops getting captured and turning traitor to their home country. So I'm just curious if you could maybe elaborate a little more on your view of sort of moral culpability in those dark places. Because the quote you gave, it almost sounded like Tolkien was saying Frodo's ultimate failure, his choice to claim the ring as his own at the end, which we might perhaps unkindly characterize as the wrong choice or as treason. It almost sounds like Tolkien was absolving him of the moral culpability of that moment due to the trauma he'd suffered up to that point and the wearing down of his will. So I'm just curious how you parse the complex nuance of, you know, making what we would judge as a morally wrong choice, yet almost maybe absolving him of the moral culpability of that wrong choice. I don't know. I would just love to hear more on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It's incredibly nuanced, and it's very hard because, you know, in the end, we have to say, well, God's the one that has to decide and figure it out. We're not really the ones that can figure that out. We don't know their minds. But it's interesting because Tolkien compares the breaking of the mind to the breaking of the body. And interestingly, as I've been in this world of psychiatry and psychology, it's its own medical field because it's considered, you know, mental health. Like we hear about mental health and we think, oh, that's kind of floofy. But actually, it's part of our being, you know. And it's interesting how, like, you know, you can fall and hit your head and your personality changes. Like, well, okay, so clearly there's something that is both mental and physical that's integrated. And so, of course, your mind can break. Of course, it can break just like your body breaks because there's something that is so intertwined there. And then when you go through, you know, the torture and you know, the trauma, and you know, people apostatize or they, you know, turn traitors to their country, it's so hard because, like, what do you do? It's complex. And I think Tolkien recognized that. He just wrestled with it. It was just, well, it's almost like, I don't know, but clearly he couldn't have said no in that situation. So yeah, he did absolve Frodo at that point, but he said actually Frodo's great, you know, sin, I guess, is that he was prideful, and it had nothing to do with all of that actually. Or no, sorry, that was Sam. That was prideful. I'm sorry, but yeah, I mean, Frodo. You know, he was constantly looking inward, especially afterwards, of his failure and, you know, blaming himself. And, you know, you hear that, you know, this self-focus, it's very selfish, right? And so, I don't know, it's complex, it's nuanced, it's difficult. And I think that's why mercy is so important, because we don't know. Like, how much could that person have said no in that situation? Maybe there's a little piece of their mind that could have said no, and they just chose not to use that sliver of their mind. It's hard, but mercy, that's why mercy is important.
Thank you, that was great. I guess I'm trying to think about how I can phrase my question, is that when you make this comparison to Frodo and Gollum's relation to the ring, do you think, like, I guess my question would be, is there a difference is there more to it that Frodo still had this hope to him where he allowed some of this help even at the latter end of his relationship with the ring? Is there more to it than just Gollum had it much longer than Frodo, so that's the way he is, and that Frodo would have ended up the same way if he kept it longer? Or is it more to it than just him at the beginning of his journey?
So you're asking, is Gollum more, so he's had it for longer, therefore he's kind of set in his ways, versus Frodo, who hasn't had as long, so he could recover and heal? I think that is the case. Gollum had it 500 years, and there probably wasn't, I don't want to say there wasn't a road to recovery, because there's always some kind of hope, but his life probably wasn't long enough to find go through that long journey. But I think that's why his love for Frodo was so important, is because that was the redemption. And maybe if the ring had been destroyed without Gollum losing his life, maybe there would have been a path to recovery. And that's probably true. There probably would have been a path to recovery. It just would have been a lot harder than Frodo's path, and different, very different, because Frodo was traumatized in a different way, whereas Gollum had always been selfish prior to becoming Gollum. So he was just kind of a nasty creature even before he found the ring. So, I think it is, yes, a lot of it is the longevity of how long did he have the ring? How much is he set in his ways? And we are creatures trapped in time. So, and even Tolkien said that, Frodo went to Valinor to find healing if he could. So he wasn't even saying it was a definitive, but he was saying he could try. So.
I loved your presentation. It has me thinking about the character of Samwise, though, as being the supporter of the person maybe going through the addictive process. And I wondered if you talk a little bit more to the fact that in Frodo's case, Sam is so helpful to Frodo and vital to his coming through, but he's also the character that pushes Gollum over the edge. Mm-hmm. I don't know, that's such a weird dichotomy in one character, and I wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's also where Sam's pride comes in. That he loves Frodo, he's going to protect Frodo to the end, but he's also kind of cocky, and that's how Tolkien described him. And so that is hard because you can't control what happens to you, or like Gollum couldn't control how Sam treated him. But in the end, we can only make a choice based on what's given to us. And so that is hard. That is really hard when you've got someone like Sam pushing someone over the edge. And Sam, could have used a little more humility in that regard, but how could he in that circumstance, because he was so protective of Frodo and could not trust this vile creature? And understandably so, he didn't trust him. So it's hard. And it's hard to know even how to approach that because you don't know people's hearts. Now, Tolkien knows their hearts because he wrote their hearts, but we don't really know how other people are thinking or what they're doing. It's mercy, and that's hard. Mercy's hard.
I really enjoyed your presentation. One of your earlier slides, you talked about the folks who were affected by addiction, and Bilbo wasn't in that list. Is there any reason why you didn't include him?
No.
Because he clearly was.
I mean, it's just a matter of who I was thinking of at that moment.
But it's interesting that Bilbo gives up the ring.
And
so there is recovery as a case study.
Yeah. And it's interesting because even at the end of Lord of the Rings, he still wants to see the ring, before he goes off to the Undying Land. So yes, he recovered, and he was able to let it go because he didn't let it possess him. But he also wasn't under the great power of Sauron and the darkness and oppression of the ring and the War of the Ring and Sauron's growing power. So it was a little bit of a different situation. And he didn't have to carry it close to him for so long as Frodo did. However, yes, the fact that he was able to have it for, I think, 50 years or however long it was, he had it that long and was able to give it up, with some effort, but he gave it up. It's just a testament to his character.
And he gives it up with help of community of Gandalf as well, so that's interesting.
Just to follow up, is that sort of a comp to my uncle, as an example? He's been sober for 35 years, but he still considers himself an alcoholic because he still has that desire that he has to suppress every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's like Frodo never stopped wanting the ring.
Thank you. That was really awesome to listen to. And one thing I wanted to reflect on, and my brain keeps steering out clear from it, is that moment where you quoted Aragorn saying the moment where hope and despair are one, or whatever that line was. And could you just try to help me get there more? Because I have a hard time grappling with that kind of collapsing.
Yeah, well, I think in that context, hope is not a feeling. Hope is an action. And so that's how Tolkien portrays hope is, for human beings, it's like, oh, well, I feel positive. I'm really hoping that it's like this. But actually, it's like, well, no, it doesn't matter how you feel. You just do it. You trust, you believe. So yes, it's about faith, it's about belief. It's like, same thing with love. Love isn't just a feeling. Love is an action. Love is a way of life. And so, yeah, you don't feel like you love that person, but you're going to act like you do because that's the right thing. And so, yeah, hope can exist simultaneously with despair because you're choosing to act in faith.
Just a question from me. So I was thinking about Jessica's presentation and about the sundering, like the separationness, and the effects of those, that the sort of gifts that each group of elves has are therefore estranged from one another. But then you're talking about the isolating effect of addiction and the recovery being a corporate thing, not a solo thing. Is there anything you draw those threads together with?
Well, I think as the peoples are sundered, they have, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends, really, because, you have the sundering of the fellowship, and as they're dispersed, yes, they don't have each other to rely on anymore, but also it allows them to go out and flourish somewhere else separately. So I think that's tricky. I think it depends why they separated, why they sundered. And I don't know. I mean, that might just be a different situation, honestly. Yeah, populating the world.
I was thinking about Boromir as an example of someone who, as it were, recovered, but his recovery was literally just to die well. And the context of dying well was for someone else, that he gave up his own thing. And I'm thinking about, what was the hope for Feanor, and therefore, what was the community he was lacking, as it were. But that's a whole little track in my mind, and I think we should probably stop there. But thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Coutras.
Thank you.
Okay, so to finish off our morning together, I would like to change gears slightly because we're going to have a musical presentation now. And I'd like to introduce Rachel to you all. One of the sort of nice side effects of switching and moving into this cathedral sanctuary space is there's physical representations of life, of light and beauty here that isn't possible in the sort of side hall that we were in last year. But now we have a different kind of representation of that because Rachel is going to sing for us. I'd like to introduce you to her. So Rachel is a singer, a music educator, and a literature enthusiast. Her passion is cultivating community through the power of music, whether in the classroom, choir, chamber music, or solo